And on the ground in Iraq, the country's biggest oil refinery, Beji, has been shut down and its foreign staff evacuated. Local staff remain in place, and the military claims it is now in control of the facility. The refinery in Beji sits less than 50 miles north of the city of Tikrit, which militants seized just last week. The Beji refinery accounts for a quarter of Iraq's entire refining capacity. And while it processes oil entirely for domestic consumption, like gasoline, cooking oil, and fuel for power stations, an outage there could lead to greater chaos in the country. The stakes for the oil markets are high as the Iraqi government tries to gain control over the situation. To talk about what the Iraqi crisis could mean for the global economy, earlier I spoke with Peter Schiff. He's the president of Euro-Pacific Capital, Inc. I first asked him how Iraq's domestic economy would be impacted if the Beji refinery falls into the hands of militants.
Well, I'm really not that sure how it's going to impact Iraq. But, I think there's a situation there that unfortunately we helped create, which is one of the reasons among many that I was opposed to us going into Iraq in the first place, because I was afraid that once we went in there and withdrew, that something like this would happen. And now we're in a situation where we have no good policy options left.
Well, Iraq is the second largest oil producer in OPEC and has the fifth largest crude oil reserves. When you look at the global economy, how large of a role does Iraq play in the world's oil market?
Well, on the margin, it's a significant supplier, and I'm bullish on oil anyway. I think the price of oil is going up regardless of what happens in Iraq. But to the extent that Iraqi production is disrupted by civil war, that's only going to be more bullish for the price of oil, and it's going to affect the global economy in that oil is going to be more expensive, and that's going to be a negative unless, of course, you own oil and you've got it to sell. So there are some economies that might benefit, those that are supplying oil into the market, and others that have to buy oil are going to have to pay more for it, and that's like a tax.
And what kind of impact could the crisis have specifically on large gas consumption countries like China and India? Would they have to look elsewhere?
Well, there's oil as long as they're willing to pay for it. And, it's just going to bid the price up. And I think the demand is going to continue to grow in emerging markets like China and Asia. I'm more worried about, or China, India, I'm more worried about how it might affect the United States because American consumers are already tapped out. They're loaded up with debt. They've got part-time, low-paying jobs, and Americans drive a lot. More than any other people, we're dependent on our cars. We don't have a really great public transportation system. A lot of Americans have to drive a long way to get to their low-paying jobs, and they may not be able to afford higher gasoline prices. I think the Chinese or the Indians, based on how little they drive, are more likely to afford the increases than Americans.
So do you expect the price of gas to go up in the coming days for American drivers?
Well, I can't forecast it in the coming days. In general, I think the price is more likely to go up on any given day than it is go down, because I think gas prices are headed much, much higher. It's interesting. We got the Fed minutes today, and Janet Yellen in her testimony said that she's still worried that inflation is too low, that inflation is below her target. First of all, inflation can't be too low. The lower, the better. But if you look at the trailing CPI for the last 12 months, even the government acknowledges that inflation is just above 2%. So how is 2.1 below their 2% target? I don't know how the Fed is massaging these numbers, and it's likely that inflation numbers are going to get higher, trend higher in the future, and obviously significant increases in oil prices that's going to bleed through to the pump, and also in electricity bills. That is only going to make the CPI worse.
Well, we've heard a lot of talk about energy independence from the Middle East in the U.S. Take a listen to this clip of what a North Dakota Treasury Secretary said to U.S. troops earlier this year.
To help make our nation and our world an energy independent country so that you and your fellow officers and enlisted folks never have to go over there again in order to fight for the oil that we all need.
So apparently we're going over there to fight for oil. What are your thoughts on what she had to say?
Well, that may be the very reason that we went there in the first place. It might have been over oil. Some people thought it was over other things. But, I can certainly feel for families that lost loved ones or Americans who lost limbs and saw their comrades fall because they were told they were there to restore an independent and democratic Iraq, and now the whole thing is falling apart. And we may, in fact, leave Iraq in a worse place than when we found it. And it may even be a greater threat to America as a result of having deposed Saddam than it would have been had we left him in power.
And considering the U.S. has spent large amounts of money on this war, of course, also on the Afghanistan war, how much should that weigh on their decision on the kind of involvement they choose to have in Iraq right now?
Well, first of all, you know, we borrowed the money, which is even worse. And so if we're going to go back into Iraq, which we're going to have to do if we want to prevent the country from disintegrating, we're going to have to borrow even more money. But here's the problem. And I mean, you know, you're talking about two wrongs, maybe making it right. We never should have went in there in the first place. But if we don't go back in there, the whole thing is going to fall apart and our whole foreign policy is going to collapse. If we do go back in there to restore order, we can never leave. It's like a permanent occupancy of Iraq. How is that going to go over in the Middle East? And how much money are we going to have to borrow to pay for that?
All right, Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital, thanks for joining us.